What if a single failed diplomatic meeting pushes the Middle East toward a historic war? What if the collapse of talks in Geneva triggers not just airstrikes, but the possible downfall of an entire government? These are no longer distant hypotheticals. According to a recent report by BBC, the failure of upcoming Geneva negotiations between Washington and Tehran could open the door to a dramatic and dangerous new chapter in global politics, one that may reshape the Middle East for decades to come. As tensions rise, the United States has been quietly but steadily assembling an unprecedented level of military power across the region. Aircraft carriers, advanced fighter jets, missile defense systems, and naval strike groups have been positioned within striking distance of Iran. Meanwhile, public warnings from former U.S. President Donald Trump have added fuel to the fire, with repeated statements suggesting that both limited and large-scale military action remain firmly on the table. Military analysts warn that this confrontation could rival or even surpass the devastation of the 2003 Iraq War or the 1990 Gulf War. Among those sounding the alarm is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander James G. Stavridis, who has cautioned that a war with Iran could become one of the most destructive conflicts the region has ever seen. According to the BBC's analysis, if the Geneva talks collapse and Washington authorizes military action, the most likely first step would be a series of targeted U.S. strikes against Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and key components of its nuclear infrastructure. These initial attacks would likely be described as limited, but experts warn they could quickly spiral beyond control. One potential outcome is the collapse of the Iranian government itself. Another equally significant possibility is that the government survives, but is forced into a radical policy shift, similar to the so-called Venezuela model, where internal control remains intact, but external behavior changes under sustained pressure. Such changes could include a sharp reduction in Tehran's support for armed groups across the Middle East, strict limitations on its missile and nuclear programs, and a restructuring of its regional strategy. There is also growing concern that prolonged conflict could lead to the establishment of a form of military rule inside Iran, further altering the country's political landscape. Despite America's overwhelming naval and air superiority, Iran is far from defenseless. Tehran possesses a vast arsenal of ballistic missiles and armed drones, many of which are hidden deep inside underground facilities, mountain tunnels, and fortified caves. These systems are designed to survive initial attacks and respond with force. U.S. military planners acknowledge that neutralizing all of Iran's launch capabilities would be extremely difficult. American military bases across the Gulf region could become primary targets. Installations in Bahrain and Qatar are considered particularly vulnerable, potentially serving as Tehran's strongest pressure points. If Iran perceives an existential threat, analysts believe it could also expand retaliation beyond U.S. assets, possibly striking Jordan or Israel, dramatically widening the scope of the conflict. Iran's wartime strategy has historically relied on saturation tactics, launching large numbers of explosive drones, missiles, and naval torpedoes simultaneously. Even the most advanced missile defense systems can be overwhelmed under such conditions, raising the risk of serious damage to U.S. naval forces operating in the region. Only days ago, during ongoing diplomatic exchanges, Iran temporarily closed the Strait of Hormuz for several hours while conducting live fire exercises. The message was unmistakable. Tehran is willing and able to disrupt one of the world's most critical energy corridors. Reports have also confirmed joint naval drills between Iranian forces and Russia in the Gulf of Oman and the Indian Ocean, signaling that Iran is actively strengthening its military partnerships beyond the region. Perhaps the most dangerous consequence of a U.S.-Iran war would be the broader destabilization of the Middle East. A full-scale conflict could ignite proxy wars, sectarian violence, and internal unrest across multiple countries. While some regional actors, particularly Israel, may quietly support the end of Iran's Islamic Republic, few truly want to see a nation of more than 93 million people collapse into chaos. Such instability would send shockwaves through neighboring countries, trigger refugee crises, disrupt global energy markets, and create security nightmares far beyond the battlefield. Even nations that oppose Tehran's policies recognize that a fragmented Iran could be far more dangerous than a contained one. As the world watches the Geneva talks with growing anxiety, one reality is becoming clear. The outcome of these negotiations may determine whether diplomacy prevails or whether the Middle East is pushed toward one of the most consequential wars of the 21st century.